And welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with Curtin University and the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dana Poole and Dr. Ashley Thornton, and together we will interview world-leading researchers in the area of child health to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
The team at the Research Works podcast acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land and waters on which we live and work. We pay our respects to all First Nations peoples, elders past and present, and would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record this podcast each week, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We recognise their continued connection to this beautiful budja we call home.
Well, welcome to another episode of the Research Works podcast. It's so great to have you guys join us again. I do have to make a comment about the weather. If you live in the Southern Hemisphere in Australia, it is so cold at the moment. But for you guys in the Northern Hemisphere, I really hope you enjoy your summer on our behalf.
Absolutely. I actually drove here into the studio with my seat warmers on today.
Oh, nice.
Which was very pleasant, but hopefully not for too much longer.
Yeah. I mean, it was 6 degrees. I feel like 6 degrees doesn't sound cold for people in the Northern Hemisphere, but we don't have central heating.
We're
like
not
you guys
equipped
do.
for 6 degrees.
No, and we're really not. I don't feel like I've got anything warm enough for that, but I digress. Let's introduce you guys to our very special guest today. I've been wanting to speak to her for a long time. We've got Ellen Armstrong on the show today. Hello, Ellen.
Hi, guys. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Oh, we're really excited to talk to you today.
Yay.
And this week we're going to be discussing, I suppose, one main paper that of Ellen's, but we'll probably also talk a bit broadly on your PhD, Ellen, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So the article that we're going to be talking about is titled "A Qualitative Analysis of the Experiences of Children with Cerebral Palsy and Their Caregivers in a Goal-Directed Cycling Program." And it was published recently in Disability and Rehabilitation this year, 2022. So another hot off the press article.
I love it.
We need a little soundbite for
we
that,
actually
don't
really
we?
do, don't we? Yeah. There you go.
So let's, before we get stuck into the paper, let's tell you a bit about Ellen. Ellen completed her PhD in physiotherapy at Griffith University, Queensland in 2020. Ellen completed a Masters of Science degree in Adapted Physical Activity at the University of Leuven in Belgium under the prestigious Erasmus Mundus Scholarship, and a Masters of Physiotherapy and Bachelor of Exercise Science degree at Griffith University. Her areas of expertise include adapted cycling for people with disability, goal-directed training for children with cerebral palsy, physical activity participation, and physical activity barriers experienced by young people with visual impairments. Currently, Ellen works full-time in a clinical role at the Queensland Department of Education, providing adjustments and support for students with disability to access and participate in the curriculum. Separate to her clinical role, she's actively involved in research projects in the areas of paediatric rehabilitation and physical activity participation, including an NHMRC-funded RCT, Active Stride CP.
Gosh, it's very impressive. Not just impressive in terms of what Ellen does, but honestly, you're very good, Ash, at all those. There's a lot of big words in a lot of these bios.
You always give me the big
words.
And
I always
Dana.
give it to you because you do such a great job of it. I was so impressed.
Keep me on my toes.
But Ellen, goodness me, what a beautiful CV in terms of all the things that you're doing and working full-time clinically. And there's the Active Stride CP study as well, which I really want to talk about, which we'll talk about a little bit later as we go through the podcast, I suppose. But goodness, you've been busy.
Oh, thank you. It's always funny listening to your bio because, it's just, I'm sure everyone has an impressive bio, but
it's nice that you're gushing about. A bit of humility is always nice when you have a CV that looks like that, hey?
Absolutely. So, Ellen, you've probably listened to the podcast before, but if you haven't, we like to do a little icebreaker question before we get started. And today's question is, well, it's not really a question. It's more of a asking you to explain something. It's tell us about your worst haircut ever.
Okay. There's been a few of them, but I think the one that comes to mind straight away is I was in high school. So around the time that you really care about your appearance and what people think of you.
Yes.
And I was obsessed with Jennifer Aniston from Friends at the time.
That phase.
Yep.
Yes,
I think we've all been there.
Yeah.
So I had cut out a picture of Jennifer Aniston. It was before the school semi-formal, and took it into the hairdresser. And of course, she has very different hair to me, so it was never going to work out.
Yeah.
And I ended up, she has beautiful volume in her hair, and she probably has a whole team of stylists around her.
Correct.
But I ended up with the horrible side fringe fell across my eye that I was forever having to flick out of the way. So that was a bit of a trauma trigger for me.
Yeah.
The haircuts like that.
Is there any photographic evidence of this haircut?
I actually don't think so, because I solved the issue by like twisting it up and bobby pinning it out of the way.
As was the fashion at the time.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. No, so it probably wasn't the worst thing in the world, was it?
No, that's a good one. I feel like a lot of people relate to that. Mine that comes to mind, I've got two. One where I did it myself as a kid, grabbed scissors and cut the top part of my hair so it just stuck up for ages. My mum was so upset with me.
Yeah.
But her revenge was probably when she would cut my bangs. I call it bangs because I grew up in Canada. So she would always blame me for not standing still. So I'm not sure it's completely my fault, but she'd cut my bangs in a straight line. And then because I moved slightly, so she said, it was crooked. So my bangs just got shorter and shorter and shorter as she tried to get it straight. So I'd go to school with my bangs pretty much halfway down my forehead. And it was all apparently my fault because I kept moving. Very traumatizing, as you can tell.
Yes.
So Ash, what about you?
Oh, well, I have no excuses for this. I brought this all on myself. I think I must have been like 18 or 19 and broke up with my boyfriend, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to get a haircut. And I got bangs. I decided that at that point in my life it was a good idea to get bangs. And I, had the round chubby teenage face and the bangs, and I just like was just this big moon face walking around the world with my revenge haircut that was awful because it was no revenge on anyone there. It was horrible. And I also decided it would be a good idea to be blonde. So
you did everything at once.
Yeah, my hair's quite dark naturally. So it was blonde, it had bangs, it was awful. There is no
evidence of that?
No, definitely not. No, that's all long gone, thank goodness.
Okay, I'll just imagine it.
You just have to imagine it.
I think we've all made the bangs mistake at one point in time, haven't we?
Yeah.
And you just have to have
regret it.
It's a rite of passage.
Yeah, that's right. You got to live it out.
Yeah. You just have to have the right shaped face, I think, to be able to pull off bangs.
Yeah.
And I don't have that face.
No, and I know now that I don't either, Ellen. So.
That's called lived experience. So, yeah. All right, so this is a qualitative thematic analysis, one that I thought that Ash would be very excited about when I was reading. Aimed to capture the experiences of children with cerebral palsy and their caregivers who completed an 8-week goal-directed cycling program. So the aim was to provide insights on engagement and program feasibility. 17 interviews were conducted with 29 participants, including 9 children aged between 7 and 14 years, who were all involved in the RCT. Children with CP were classified as functioning within GMFCS levels 2 to 4, and the interviews were conducted were semi-structured, then coded, then analysed thematically. So 4 themes were identified, including facilitators and challenges to program engagement, perceived outcomes, the functional electrical stimulation or FES cycling experience, and previous cycling participation. The study concludes that children with CP enjoy riding bikes and that facilitators and challenges to engagement were identified that hold practical relevance for clinicians.
Thanks, Dana.
No problem.
So, Ellen, we were hoping that we could start with talking quite broadly about FES cycling and what that actually is, just in case any of our listeners aren't familiar.
Absolutely. How much time do you have?
I know it's a big literature review, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah. Actually, I'm currently putting together a bit of a training program for some clinicians around FES cycling, and so it's kind of fresh in my mind at the moment. And it's going through all of the literature. It's reminding me how many different components there are to FES cycling.
Yeah.
So I think the most the easiest place to start is to start talking about FES.
Yes.
FES, or functional electrical stimulation, is a type of e-stim. And I think as a new grad physio or a general member of the public, the most common type of e-stim that people are familiar with would be TENS.
Yes.
Like the TENS machines that you might get at a community physio. And I think the key distinction between TENS and FES is that TENS is it's applied to the skin via a surface electrode, which is the same, but it's set at a level that targets the sensory nerves, and that's for the purpose of modulating pain. So you get a tingly sensation, and it's meant to interfere with the pain pathways. For functional electrical stimulation, it looks similar. So you still put a sticky pad on the skin.
Yes.
But the parameters are set different so that it's actually targeting a motor neuron.
Yes.
And what you're trying to get is a muscle contraction. Yeah. And so the biggest distinction between FES and all of the other types of e-stim that are out there is that it's applied over the muscle group that you're using in a specific activity while that activity is taking place.
That's right.
So in my case, it was cycling, but it could be doing a sit-to-stand transfer, or it could be stepping or treadmill walking. FES cycling broadly refers to any kind of cycling, whether it's a stationary bike or otherwise, while you're receiving electrical impulses to those muscles that are involved in the activity.
Yeah, that was a good explanation, because I think it's always worthwhile talking about the broad view of FES. I mean, I absolutely love FES. I've been to FES conferences just on their own. Yeah, and they just do FES. So I was like, I love this stuff. And there's the parameters and all the things that you need to know. But I think people are really familiar with TENS, aren't they? And that's a really good way to describe it, like that tingly sensation. So can we just sort of talk a little bit about parameters? We'll just nerd out a little bit there. Because I think it's really worthwhile as clinicians, if you're wanting to use this as part of your intervention, the parameters that you choose are actually really important for tolerance and motor output.
Yes.
So what's the main difference in parameters for something like TENS versus motor?
Okay.
Particularly around frequency, maybe. I think that's probably the biggest one, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think too, when we're talking about any kind of e-stimulation, there's three main parameters that we need to be aware of and get our heads around. The first of them is what's called a pulse width. So pulse width, if you think of a tap and you're turning a tap on and water's flowing through, if the water is the electrical current, then the pulse width is how long that tap is turned on for.
Great.
Is the best way I can describe it. So it's the duration of the pulses that are applied to the muscle. The next important parameter would be amplitude. Amplitude is the thing that we adjust on the fly most often. So it's all about how much water is flowing through that tap or how many electrons are flowing through. And then there's frequency, and that's how many times per second we're turning that tap on and off. And so to achieve a motor response when you're using FES, you have to have the right combination of those three parameters.
Yes.
So this is really challenging to describe.
I know. It's really tricky. But no, I think you're doing a great job, because I think thinking about it from a water tap perspective, I haven't thought about it from that before. Like, how many times have you turned the water tap on, you're like, turn it off, you're wasting all the water. But if you think about how much energy then goes through that, if you leave the tap on and off, that's the amount of input that's going into the muscle, right?
That's right. Yeah. And so when you increase the frequency when you're using e-stim, you're trying to generate a stronger contraction.
Yeah.
Right.
And so if we're thinking about FES parameters, you generally get the frequency that I was using in my study was between 40 and 60 hertz.
Yeah.
But we decided that 50 hertz was around about the sweet spot where we're getting a nice contraction, because the higher the frequency, the more motor neurons you're kind of stimulating, and you're generating a stronger contraction, but you're also fatiguing the muscle faster. So there is a study out there that I've referenced in my thesis, and they looked at the force frequency curve of a quadricep muscle in an adult, and they worked out that as you increase frequency, you get a stronger and stronger contraction, but only to a certain point.
Right.
And so that sweet spot seemed to be around about the 50 hertz, because if you increased it anything more than that, you weren't generating any more muscle force,
That's right.
but you were fatiguing the muscle faster.
Yep.
That makes sense.
Okay, so one of the important parameters is pulse width. So can you talk us through a little bit about what pulse width is and what sort of parameters you'd use for that?
Absolutely. So pulse width is the duration that the electrical impulses are applied for. And it's measured, we talk about pulse width in terms of microseconds, because it's a measure of time, essentially. When we're adjusting pulse width, generally a lower pulse width will recruit less of the sensory neurons. And as you increase that pulse width, you get more and more of the motor neurons. And so if you're using FES in a person with a spinal cord injury who doesn't have sensation, then they'll generally tolerate a much larger pulse width than someone with sensation.
Yes.
And so that's something to keep in mind when you've got a child with cerebral palsy in front of you. I feel like they tolerated a lower pulse width.
And that makes sense. Because often their
absolutely.
sensations either intact or they have altered sensations. So we
Yes,
don't actually
that's
know what
right.
it is that they're feeling. So
Yes.
it's always a balanced pulse width, isn't it? You either go, you want high because you want motor, but then they'll feel it. So
That's
it's again
right.
just sort of balancing that out for the muscle size and for the kid.
Yeah. And I think it's worth noting too that when we're thinking about the intensity of the electrical stimulation, that's the product of the pulse width and the amplitude.
Yeah, that's right.
And so if you're not getting, well, I'm just talking to the patients that I had in my research study, but I noticed that as we're turning up the amplitude for some of those kids, they wouldn't tolerate a level that was high enough to elicit a muscle contraction.
Yeah.
And so then we had to go back to look at the pulse width and adjust it. To try and find that sweet spot where it's comfortable, but it's also high enough to get that palpable muscle contraction.
Yeah. I imagine that takes quite a bit of time, does it, to try and play around with all these parameters so that you have the right combination for each of your participants?
Yes, it's interesting. Some kids, it just worked straight away, and others took a little bit of fine tuning. And even from week to week, there were fluctuations. So the parameters that worked 1 week to get a muscle contraction didn't necessarily work the next week. And that could be to do with the electrodes might have been slightly in a different location and little things like that. But it did take a little bit of time to tweak some of those things.
Yeah. And then this is not my area of expertise. So I obviously won't be replacing Tell It to Ed, but I just wanted to ask what might be a silly question around like how you time the stimulation. So like when you're talking about activities like cycling or, walking or things where you're trying to elicit different patterns of muscle activation at different times, how do you time that?
Yeah, this is actually a brilliant question, and it's not stupid at all. I think FES has evolved so much over the last few years. And previously you would actually have to set your, like if you had a standalone device, you would actually have to set it with on-off times,
right?
Which was it's actually quite difficult to do. I remember having to do it with a sit to stand activity at uni and having to try and time it. It's really tricky because your patient might not do the sit to stand in that amount of time.
Yeah.
But now we have these wonderful systems that actually integrate the FES into their system. So the FES bike that I actually used is programmed so that it delivers the stimulation to the correct muscle that should be contracting at that particular point in the pedal arc.
Oh, that's cool.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Really cool.
That's a really clever way it's a very clever solution.
Yeah, it is. And it's all based on the angle. So the angle of the crank arm, when it's, at the top of the pedal arc, then it knows that it has to stimulate this group of muscles. And when it's at the bottom, then it will stimulate the other group. So you're getting this reciprocal on-off that is adjusted based on the speed that the child's cycling at.
Yeah. So it's completely tailored to their action.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And actually that's really, that's a really good point that you've brought up, because when the kids were on the cycle ergometer, I had to find a resistance that slowed them down so that they were actually getting that stimulation. Because if you cycle too fast, you're getting this really quick on-off of the stimulation, and they're not actually getting a therapeutic dose.
Yeah.
So that was actually another thing that I had to keep in the back of my mind. when we were adjusting parameters and things.
Yeah. Lots of things to think about there, aren't they? And and I love that you've sort of gone through that part of it, because I think it leads really nicely into sort of why you did the study and the qualitative part of it. And I think just to sort of, I guess, reiterate and build, and just to supplement what you just said there as well in terms of that resistance. I love that you brought that up, because there is a ramp up and ramp down time with stimulation. It doesn't just come on and come off. That's not really tolerable. If you ever have stim done to yourself, it's like on, off, and you just be jolting the whole time. So we're working with kids. We want it to be tolerable. So you do a gradual ramp up, which might take a few seconds, and then you do a gradual ramp down. So if you're going too fast, you're just ramping and ramping down again. You're never getting that threshold for a muscle contraction. So it's worth keeping that in mind. That's another set of parameters to think about, aren't they? So there's quite a few things to consider, which is why we do studies and why it's really good to talk it through as well.
That's right. Yeah. And I think I had the benefit of using a machine where the FES was integrated and you could adjust those parameters using like a little iPad that's attached to the machine. So it was, I think, a lot easier to do now compared to what clinicians had to do 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. All right, well, should we talk a little bit more about, so the study I sort of said in the sort of build up into it, this was based on your big RCT. Can you talk us through a little bit about the study itself and what you did?
Absolutely, yes. So the main study was a randomized control trial, and it looked at the efficacy of an 8-week training program compared to usual care. The training program was developed, I included both ambulant and non-ambulant children in my study, but the target population really were those children who were walking with a walker or a wheelchair. And so the training program consisted of 2 sessions at a clinic per week and a 1-hour home exercise program each week. So they were getting 3 hours of therapy for 8 weeks. And the clinic sessions were slightly different to the home exercise program. The clinic sessions had 30 minutes of FES cycling, which is led by the therapist, and then 30 minutes of goal-directed exercises that had a progressive resistance training element to them. But they were based around the child's either cycling goals or transfer goals, keeping in mind that our target population were the kids with GMFCS 3 and 4. The home exercise program was a little bit different. It included task-specific practice of those goal activities. So it could be getting in and out of the car, or it could be for one of my girls, her big goal was getting on and off the couch independently. That was the most important thing, so that she could sit in the best seat.
That's right. Yeah, with the whole family.
She hated that her brother would always take the middle seat in the couch, and so that was her big goal, was to be able to get on and off the couch. That's great. That's right. And then 30 minutes, or a minimum of 30 minutes of at-home cycling. So some children had their own adapted bikes already, and if they didn't, then we found a loan one through the hospital or one of our clinical networks, and we set them up so that they could ride outside or in the park or wherever it was that they wanted to cycle with their family.
That's really cool.
Yeah, I love that. And as part of the RCT, you incorporated a qualitative component, which is what we're going to focus on, over the next little bit when we talk about the results. So just tell us what the aim of the qualitative component of your study was.
Yeah, sure. So there were a lot of different quantitative outcomes that we included in the RCT, and they were very much focused on gross motor function and goal performance, satisfaction, those sorts of things that you can kind of quantify with a number.
Yeah.
But we purposely included a qualitative element because I knew that there were lots of valuable feedback that we could get from participants that could either inform our clinical practice when we're using FES cycling or adapted cycling, or even inform how we develop similar trials in the future, if that makes sense, because it was a very complex training program, and I think there's a lot of information that you just can't get from a standardized quantitative measure.
Absolutely, particularly when you're trying to unpack, feasibility of rolling out, a larger scale trial or incorporating what you're doing within the trial into clinical practice. It's so important, isn't it, to understand the perspective of the people that you're working with on that.
Absolutely. And we included the qualitative aspect of the trial right at the beginning. So that was all planned for. But as I was going through the training session with some of these kids, I was actually reflecting and thinking, I'm so grateful that we included this qualitative part, because they were giving me feedback during training sessions. And I was thinking, oh, that's really useful information for clinicians to know.
Yeah.
And it's good to be able to actually get that information out there in the form of a research study rather than just anecdotal, like this happened and this was said.
Yeah, yeah. It's like formalizing that feedback process, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how you collected and analysed that qualitative information. And you don't have to go into detail because, you know, we've talked a little bit about, you know, various qualitative pieces before. So I think our listeners have a bit of an understanding. But just a broad overview of how you actually went about that.
Absolutely. I'll preface this by saying that I am by no means a qualitative expert, but I drew on the works of much more experienced qualitative researchers before me. So we followed just a basic process for a thematic analysis. So we had a list of semi-structured interview questions that we developed at the beginning of the trial. And at the end of the training program, we had 2 clinicians who were familiar with the training program but weren't super familiar with the children conduct the interviews. And that was done so that, you know, if they didn't like the trial or if they didn't enjoy FES, they didn't feel like they were letting me down if I was interviewing them.
So important.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we did all of those interviews at the end of the study. Then they were transcribed. And we had 2 separate clinicians, I was one of them, go through each and every statement that the child or the family made, and we coded those statements completely separately. And then over a period of about 6 months, it felt like a really long time, we kept coming back together and trying to organize all of those codes and put it in a kind of like a mind map that made sense of all of the information. Over that time, we refined it down to 4 major themes and then a bunch of sub-themes within all of those topics.
Yeah, fantastic. And Dana and I, you heard us laughing as you said it took about 6 months because we were just, I think we were both thinking back to the time that we did that also for another paper, for a paper.
It does take a while. And that's why it's good to go through that, like in terms of a methodology, because it's not anecdotal. It would be really clear that this is a very systematic process in gaining feedback and perspectives, isn't it? And I think that's really clear, right?
Yes. Especially once you've gone through it, isn't it? You know, you have a real appreciation for just how much information you're dealing with,
and how different it is. What, like, for someone to say something's anecdotal, like no, that is anecdotal, but this is not anecdotal. Do you know the process?
This is very rigorous.
That's right. It was very, very in depth. And we even went as far as having a third person come in once we'd refined all of the information. We had our skeleton themes just to go through and say, yep, okay, I agree or I don't agree, because we had read these transcripts over and over and over.
The good old critical friendly approach. I like it.
Absolutely.
I like it. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's get stuck into those themes then, those 4 main themes that you talked about. And the first one was program engagement. So why don't you talk us through some of your main findings around, you know, how families engaged with the program?
So program engagement was the biggest of all of the themes, so much so that I had to create its own diagram in the research paper. There was a lot of beautiful information that we got from families and children, but when it boiled down to it, a lot of them related to factors that helped them participate in a study and factors that were barriers to them. For facilitators, there were 7 that were identified. I'll just list them in no particular order. They were participant-driven goal setting, so having a program that was driven by the child's goals, what was important to the child as well as the family. Training was fun, individualized and adaptable, and that was really related to that goal-driven program. Access to free therapy was a really big one for parents and caregivers, understandably. Program convenience was very important to families as well. So things like having access to free parking at the hospital. We all know how hard that can be sometimes. And having flexible appointments. So I was offering after school appointments and Saturday appointments, which families really valued. Interestingly, though, one of my teenagers actually said that she didn't like having a Saturday session because that was her day to relax.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting to hear. Therapist approach and connection with participants.
Mm-hmm.
So finding out what the kids' currency was and bonding over that and incorporating that into the training sessions was really important to both the participants and the families.
Yeah.
Having a motivation to improve health and function. So that was from the point of view of the actual families. So it came up a fair bit actually in the transcripts that families had enrolled in the program because they were motivated for their child to get stronger and to be able to ride a bike. And things like that. And then I would argue that this was probably the biggest of all of the facilitators, was that cycling was fun and enjoyable.
Yeah.
And I love how in all the things that you just talked about there, it just backs up what the clinical guidelines are and what therapy should be looking like for these kids to improve motor function. You know, like you found this differently in a different cohort of people, yet it completely just backs all of that. Yeah, that's right. It's constantly backing up our current evidence. I love that. That's really cool.
Absolutely. And this sort of feedback has really changed the way that I think about therapy and has changed my practice as well.
Yeah.
And there were 4 challenges that really came through in the interviews too, which has also been really helpful for my clinical practice, but also informing like other trials that I'm a part of. And they were travel and access. So getting to the actual therapy sessions was a bit difficult for some families, particularly if they were traveling, an hour from the Gold Coast to Brisbane. Personal factors like concentration, motivation, preferences, and the time commitment. When the kids are coming to the hospital 2 times a week for 8 weeks, there's that takes a lot of commitment and there's a lot of motivating factors that you have to incorporate to maintain their engagement there. So that was a bit challenging. Physical and environmental factors. So things like muscle fatigue and muscle soreness, getting on and off the bikes was challenging for some of the kids, which was not a problem in the clinical context because we had allied health assistants and we had myself there. But it was a bit challenging if they only had a single parent at home and they needed 2 people to do a safe transfer. Those sorts of factors. And then the other one was taking time off school.
That's a big factor.
Which you would think would be a barrier more for the parents, but it was interesting that one of the quotes that I included in the study was actually from a child, and it was along the lines of, I didn't enjoy taking off time from school because we're doing an art project at school and I really want to be a part of it. So that's also something to keep in mind. When we're running these sorts of programs.
Yeah, such an important consideration. And, school is such a good opportunity for all the, lots of the other F words that we talk about as well, fun and friends. And
you need to balance it all out. And that's just where these studies are so great, because therapy, in terms of what you get out of it, which I think we're going to go into next, is fantastic. But if it doesn't fit in with a family's life and what they're motivated by, then, is it worth it? And those are things we always are balancing out, aren't they?
That's right. Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the perceived outcomes. So we're talking about not the, I suppose to clarify, not the kind of the quantitative outcomes that you analysed as part of your RCT, but these are the outcomes that the families perceived they obtained as part of the program.
Yeah, these were really interesting for me to hear. There were 5 main perceived outcomes, or 5 categories that we narrowed it down to. One of them was improved riding competence. So the families felt that by doing the program and riding on the FES bike and doing the goal-directed training, that they were actually able to ride their adapted bikes at home.
It's really very task-specific again, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And it wasn't just competence, it was also the confidence. Like a lot of these kids came in never having ridden a bike before, and so it was a bit of a scary thing for them too. So I think it was quite empowering for them to be able to ride a bike at the end of the study. And then improved functional independence was a really big one. So feeling stronger, being more fit and having endurance to participate in other physical activities, and then feeling a freedom of movement was also another interesting one. Being able to participate in homeschool and community activities. One of the children talked about like participating in a 10-kilometre running race on a bike, which was really cool. And I'm not sure if it's actually included in here, but that was in one of the the interviews, and that was really awesome for her to be able to do that activity with her family in a way that was meaningful to her.
Yeah.
And she didn't have to be pushed in a stroller.
Yeah.
An acquired sense of normality. One of my favorite pieces of, it's not really a piece of feedback, it's more of a quote in the study, was a father who said, it was really nice to have kids look at my son and say, look at that kid riding that cool bike, rather than why is that kid in a stroller?
Yeah.
So that was
so
one.
powerful.
And then, absolutely. An enhanced mood, mindset and motivation was another theme that came through in terms of perceived outcomes.
God, I mean, they all sound like really familiar, benefits of exercise, it's just coming through really well there. And we found that in a lot of our qualitative work as well, Ash. How consistent is that?
So, it's the parallels are incredible.
Yeah. And, it's hard to quantify in any sort of study the impact of exercise, but, confidence, motivation, being included, it's really hard to capture that. So it's so great to have this again, just completely supporting, alternative methods of mobility, which then can support a more physical active lifestyle. And we have all those benefits.
All the beautiful downstream effects of that.
It's just so lovely. I love it. I absolutely love it.
Absolutely. And one of the cool things that came through from a couple of parents where they were saying, my child just didn't try things before, but now they're willing to try, and they're excited to
that sense of competence and confidence that builds into a person.
It goes such a long way, doesn't it? Yeah.
I love that
or
so
experiencing success in physical activity, I think was really important too. Yeah.
And it just shows how a lot of our kids haven't had that opportunity. So we present them with the same opportunity that a lot of kids may have experienced earlier, and they're starting to benefit that. So I love that. So let's talk a little bit about the next theme now, which was the actual FES cycling experience for them, because I think that's obviously very unique to this study. So what are some of the things that the families and the kids talked about with regards to this theme?
Yeah, cool. So there were 5 themes that came through when we talked about FES cycling experience. One of them was that it was fun and challenging. So some of the children really enjoyed competing against either their own times and distances or other children's times and distances. All of that was kept anonymous, but there was a whiteboard in the gym where the kids would choose their own avatar. So it might be their favorite cartoon character or artist or something like that. And they would record the total distance that they'd cycled over the study.
What a great idea.
Yeah. And some kids were really, it was there so that they could just keep track of their own distance. But what ended up happening was there was a bit of rivalry.
Yeah, of course.
between some of the kids. And that was really great. And actually at the end of the study, we got some of the participants together and we did a community bike ride. And they were asking themselves, were you Katy Perry? Were you Paw Patrol? So that they could compare the distances. So that was a fun little story.
Cool. Yeah,
but I digress. Awesome. Sorry. Electrodes were very sticky. That came up a lot in the interviews, which is interesting because when we think about electrode tolerance or stimulation tolerance, it's not just the sensation that the kids are having to tolerate, it's the stickiness of the electrodes.
Yeah. And Dana was saying before about, often these kids have altered sensations, so that stickiness can be quite challenging for them.
Oh, absolutely. And being tolerating putting the electrodes on and off is another thing to consider.
They're actually quite cold when you first put them on as well. So you do need to
gel
consider.
Is really
it's really cold. And when they take them off, I think some kids refer to them as it's so similar to what their hospital experiences are. When they're having all the bandages being taken off, and some kids likened it to that. So there's a lot of considerations. When you just whack in on some electrodes, there's more to it than that.
For them, it's
absolutely.
Yeah, it was great. You captured that.
A lot of my kids actually referred to the electrodes as sticky pads.
Sticky pads, yeah.
Sticky pads. So we've got to put the sticky pads on now. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. They're freezing when you first put them on. So we're warming them up in our hands.
That's really cool.
FES cycling was perceived as novel, which was a motivating thing for some families, and others weren't as interested in that part of it. But it is. It's sort of like it's an unique piece of equipment. A lot of kids hadn't come across it before. So that was exciting for them. Some kids just simply didn't enjoy stimulation. And that's to be expected and completely okay. But that did come through. One of the parents, and I think this quote is included in the article, but she said that her son, it was challenging to get him on the FES bike because he had a strong preference for the adapted cycling, and he just wanted to ride the bike every time he was at the hospital, around the hospital, rather than using the stationary
of course
bike. And then finally the last one was positive or neutral sensory experience. So these were the kids who were saying, oh, I didn't hate it, but I also didn't love it. That was also an interesting thing that came through.
And then the final theme was centered around the fact that there was this kind of limited experience with cycling previously. So what kinds of things did people talk about in that theme?
Sure. I think this one came through as a theme because one of the semi-structured interview questions was around what sort of experience had you had previously.
Right.
And so we did get a lot of feedback on past cycling experience. A lot of the barriers to cycling previously came down to equipment. So not having access to adapted bikes, or not having access to a way to transport those adapted bikes, not knowing that there were different bikes available for their children who use a wheelchair. All of those different things were like really, really big barriers to the children and the family cycling previously. And then the other one was requiring assistance to be able to ride a bike. So like not having the strength to actually complete a full pedal rotation, or to ride up a hill, or even just to get on and off the bike. That had been a bit of a barrier previously. And these are some of the things that we tried to address in the study. That was really interesting to hear. Like, these were the barriers previously. This is how we addressed them. And here are some recommendations for.
It makes it really practical. Like, as you're saying, I think, it's so practical if you're going to actually apply this. What's the role of the therapist? There's education, there's support, education around what kind of equipment's around, support for how to, maybe problem solve some transfers, and, how to progress it over time. So I think that's really, really cool. So I think through all of those themes, you've provided us with some great quotations and ideas, but also how to implement this if you were to look at it in your practice. So that's just wonderful. Thank you so much, Ellen. That's so cool.
Oh, no worries.
So Ellen, where to from here? I know that, we talked in your bio about how there's some, big studies that you're a part of. What's next for you and this work?
So the next big thing for us is that we're currently involved in an NHMRC funded project called Active Strides, which Dana is very familiar with.
Yes, indeed. I'm very excited.
So we're combining the FES components and the adapted cycling components from my study with Dana's work on overground treadmill training.
Yes. Both work we've talked about here, which is really cool. So exciting. I love that we've been able to combine, there are a lot of similarities, and we put this forward as an idea to run as a randomized controlled trial. And yes, hot off the press, this is about to start recruitment from next week, I think, as well. So if there's children who have cerebral palsy, GMFs level 3 and 4, they can enroll in the study in New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, and right here in WA as well. So I think it's a really exciting project. And it's very novel, hasn't been done before, combining cycling as well as partial body weight supported treadmill training. And the work that you've done, Ellen, has really contributed to all of that. So it's so cool that your work now has been able to, progress to the next part, which is what it's all about, right?
I'm so excited to see it all coming together, because it is a very big and exciting project. There's a lot of people working behind the scenes on this one.
There is a lot. So we're about to start our training. So I think you start training tomorrow and I start training next week to get all the teams up and ready. People are traveling across Australia now that the borders are open. And
How
we
exciting.
get to see people. Yay!
Oh, it's so exciting.
It is very, very cool.
Well, look forward to you both keeping us up to date on everything that happens with Active Strides. It sounds like a really great opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, it's not as exciting as the next part, which is, as we know, is Tell It to Ed. As you all know, Ed is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health, but he has been listening. He's pushing faders and buttons. Or do you push faders? I don't know.
Slide
Do one of them?
faders?
Slide faders. Anyway, that's why it's his area of expertise. But he has been learning a lot about the area. So, Ellen, can you summarize your research in about a minute or so? And Ed will have a question for you.
Absolutely. I will do my very best.
Take it away.
Okay. So I developed an 8-week training program for children with cerebral palsy, which included children who use walkers and wheelchairs to mobilise. The program was run twice a week in a clinic, and it was supplemented by a once per week home program. The clinic-based sessions included 30 minutes of goal-directed exercises and 30 minutes of cycling on a motorised stationary bike while receiving functional electrical stimulation, or FES. So FES refers to electrical impulses that are delivered to the muscle groups involved in cycling via electrodes that are placed on the skin. The home program included a task-specific training program, so task-specific practice of the child's goal activities, as well as outdoor cycling on adapted bikes. So at the end of the study, we interviewed children and their families to find out what their thoughts, feelings, and experiences were. And we learned that children really enjoyed riding adapted bikes. And while some had reservations about the stickiness of electrodes, others enjoyed participating in an activity that was challenging and novel. We also received valuable feedback about factors that made it easier or harder for families to participate, which I think will help inform how we run future trials.
Well done. You basically summarised your PhD. Well done.
That's huge.
All right, Ed, question.
Oh, so I'm limited to one question these days. So I feel a little bit like Aladdin in the movie Aladdin, where I'm trying to save my questions or to ask a question that gets me another question. So I'm going to start with that question that gets me another question.
Cheeky.
Well, so we spoke with Rachel Tuvey quite a few episodes ago about bike riding, and I kind of had some questions about whether there was something particularly special just about riding a bike, and so we kind of went through that. Now, I'm assuming that with FES and bike riding that the electrodes are probably placed on the very large leg muscles. Is that part of?
That's a really good question. Yes.
So if that's the case, and I'm just kind of harking back to the only experience I have. So when I was a much younger man, I was going to the gym very regularly. And so I learned very quickly that doing the exercises it built muscle, but not the way it did when I looked after my dietary requirements and taking the right kind of supplements and protein and all the rest of it. So my question relates to a comment that you made about stimulating the muscle, and if you stimulate it too much, that it not weakens, fatigues. That's it. Yeah. Fatigues the muscle. So was there some particular element of looking at the recovery process for kids and how they kind of dealt with that, and whether that made an impact on the results?
Such a good question.
Yeah, wow.
Go, Ellen.
This is a tricky one, Ed. Wow. So we didn't specifically look at the recovery, like there was no outcome measure or way of measuring that in our study per se. But we did, like, one of the things that we factored into the study was rest days. So it was really important to make sure that the FES cycling sessions were separated, preferably by 2 days. Sometimes it was by one, just depending on what the child and the family's timetables were like. But I think it is important to let that muscle recover, because we're taking a population that, generally speaking, hasn't done a lot of physical activity or isn't regularly involved in physical activity. And that's a gross generalization. But when we put them into a program like this and we're stimulating their muscles in a way that they haven't worked before, you do get muscle fatigue.
Yeah.
And it came through in the interviews a fair bit, actually, that, it was hard sometimes to deal with the muscle soreness and that sort of thing. But I think you've just identified a really good research question.
Yeah.
I think we need to do another study.
Ed, maybe you could do like a master's or a...
Yeah, that's right. We could incorporate that in. Look, that was a great question.
Didn't I get an honorary PhD a few episodes
I
ago?
think you did,
We downgraded.
Now you got to go back and do the work.
Yeah, that's right. But great question. And I think, you'd already thought about that in terms of how you space out your therapy sessions is to have rest. And that's really important when we're considering our interventions. If you're going to go intensive, you've got to be intensive, but, really thought through how you're going to do it to get the most out of it. It's no point, smashing a muscle that's really tired.
That's right. And I think it's worth mentioning too, like the brilliant piece of equipment that we use did actually have an inbuilt function so that if the child was falling below what we call the target speed, so the speed we want them to cycle at for a certain period of time, so it might be like a minute, then the machine automatically goes into what's called a passive mode, so that the stimulation will stop and then they go into like an active recovery.
So smart.
Yeah.
Well, Ellen, you've got so much pearls of wisdom that you have given us today. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I listen to your podcast a lot, so I was very excited to get your email and a little bit nervous, if I'm honest.
Oh, no, we thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you today, and I feel like I learnt a lot, so thank you.
Well done. Well, to all of our listeners, remember you can get a hold of the show notes as well as the link to the paper on researchworks.net, and there's a CPD format that you can fill out there as well. Remember to hit subscribe on your favourite podcast app so you know when all the new episodes are out. So that'll be a wonderful way to keep in touch with everything that we're doing. But for now, we'll say goodbye and we'll talk to you all again next time. Thanks so much, Ellen. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.